Good evening, I'm Kerry O'Brien. It's 16 years since America voted in a Democrat as president. Some are arguing the country Bill Clinton now has to lead is facing a midlife crisis, and there are doubts that anyone can halt the slide. On Late Line tonight, we'll be tapping the American psyche straight after the news.
I'm Clive Hale. Good evening. Thanks for joining us. Heading tonight's late edition news, George Bush's last hurrah as the South rises again in the United States. Bill Clinton and Al Gore from the former Confederate states of Arkansas and Tennessee have swept to power on the first all-Southern presidential ticket since the American Civil War. As well as winning the popular vote, the Democrat pair have locked up at least 390 electoral college votes. That's 120 more than was needed to put Clinton in the White House.
On this day, with high hopes and brave hearts, in massive numbers, the American people have voted to make a new beginning.
It was an historic win, sealed within a few hours of the polls closing. The Clinton-Gore new generation of leadership had swept the Midwest, the industrialised North, the South and California. The overwhelming mood for change embraced states that hadn't voted Democrat since the 60s. The only comfort for George Bush was that he'd at least won his adopted home state of Texas by a narrow margin. The voters had turned against a man they considered a failure in addressing the nation's pressing economic and social problems. A man left to ponder life after the White House.
I'm going to serve and try to find ways to help people, but I plan to get very active in the grandchild business.
Washington will have single-party rule, with the Democrats retaining control of the House, despite some Republican gains, and enlarging their majority in the Senate. In Canberra, Prime Minister Keating has urged Bill Clinton to use his overwhelming mandate in the interests of a stronger US economy and freer world trade.
First up, the Prime Minister intends to write to the President-elect congratulating him on his victory.
We're encouraged by the moderate and internationalist foreign policy stance that Governor Clinton articulated during the election campaign. He's also affirmed strong support for the multilateral trading system.
Although quick to seek a meeting with Clinton, Australia's farmers are less sanguine about their prospects with the Democrat in the White House. News today that crucial trade talks between the US and Europe have broken down hasn't improved their mood, but at this early stage, the President-elect is being given the benefit of the doubt.
He is protectionist and he wants America to look after itself. But I don't think he's the aggressive type person that would really shatter the chance of getting any solution to GATT.
One thing Bill Clinton certainly won't do is renew the contract of the US ambassador in Australia. The staunch Republican supporter Mel Sembler today was something of a last hurrah.
The reaction has been cautious in Japan, which has been engaged in its own trade skirmish with the US. From Tokyo, Philip Williams.
Many Japanese will be concerned that their $50 billion trade surplus with the United States will trigger retaliatory action from the Congress, no longer constrained by the presidential veto. Tokyo would also be looking for assurances from the new president on defense. Already the US has pulled its forces out of the Philippines. South Korea is next on the list. That leaves bases in Japan, with Bill Clinton already saying that the budget deficit and military spending will have to be cut. The Japanese may have to become more self-reliant. The problem for Japan and the region is that Bill Clinton, the man, and his foreign policies are largely a mystery. One direction is clear. President-elect Clinton says he'll review China's most favoured trade status if it doesn't improve its human rights record. And a likely winner, Vietnam, nearly 20 years of trade embargoes will almost certainly be lifted early in the new presidential term.
Financial markets have given Bill Clinton the nod of approval, with the US dollar rising sharply on news of his win. Asian share markets have also performed well, ahead of expected gains in New York tonight. The mood flowed on to Australia, where the All Ordinaries added more than 1%, and our dollar also gained ground. Briefly now in other news, the Prime Minister has dismissed opposition demands that John Dawkins give evidence before a Senate investigation into the loans affair, saying he won't allow his Treasurer to appear before the inquiry. And Aboriginal Deaths in Custody Commissioner Hal Wotton-Kwusi has accused the federal and state governments of not taking seriously his main recommendation that imprisonment be used as a last resort. Now, a quick check of tomorrow's national weather for you. A few showers for Sydney, thundery showers in Perth and a late storm for Darwin. Mainly fine in Canberra and Melbourne and fine in the other capital cities. ABC News to this minute. I'm Clive Hale. Thanks for watching the ABC Late Edition. We're back for you again tomorrow. Meantime, have a great night and stay with us now for a late line analysis of America under President Clinton. Good night.
Americans have decided Bill Clinton is the man to reshape their country, the man to close the gap between rich and poor, black and white, the haves and the have-nots.
I really think that Bill Clinton represents the student's voice. He represents the young people of America. He represents change. He represents what we haven't gotten in the past years.
But is Bill Clinton a fresh start for America, or are the country's problems more deeply rooted? Tapping the American psyche, that's our story tonight.
Live from Canberra, the ABC's Late Line. Here's Kerry O'Brien.
Welcome to the program. So, after 12 years of Reagan and Bush, and for only the second time in 24 years, America has a Democrat for president. Clinton campaigned under the slogan, "It's time for a change." And tonight we'll explore why there might be a need for change, where the last remaining superpower is headed, and whether Clinton is capable of changing any of the fundamentals, assuming they need changing. There's an increasingly troubled picture emerging of a nation in crisis with its preeminence at risk and its self-confidence eroding. The Cold War's over, the economy is in disarray. There's a sense of urban decay, race relations deteriorating as evidenced by the Los Angeles riots earlier this year, 35 million Americans with no health insurance, the gap between the rich and the poor growing. Those who look through the gloom and point to signs of economic recovery and national strength are increasingly lonely voices. But with a baby boomer in the White House elected on a mandate for change, the hope is for a revitalised America at the beginning of the 21st century. Tonight, I'm joined by 4 prominent American thinkers to discuss the mood of America and what the future holds for the country which has dominated the rest of the world for so much of this century. Professor Noam Chomsky is Professor of Modern Languages and Linguistics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. His work in linguistics has been compared to the unravelling of the genetic code of the DNA molecule. He's also been a leading anti-establishment voice and anti-war activist since the 60s. A tireless critic of the status quo, who is perhaps better known in the rest of the world than he is inside his own country. He was described once in the New York Times Book Review as arguably the most important intellectual alive today. Not a bad rap. Chomsky joins us from Boston. Stephen Hess is Senior Fellow in Governmental Studies at the Brookings Institute in Washington, D.C. He was on the Advisory Council of the Republican Party when Ronald Reagan was elected, and has also been an advisor in Eisenhower and Nixon administrations. In this election, he voted for Bill Clinton, and Dr. Hess joins us from Washington. Professor Juanima Lubiano is Professor of English and Afro-American Studies at Princeton University. She's an author and has been a critic of the conservative social policies of the Reagan-Bush era, and is a voice of feminism and black activism. Professor Lubiano joins us from New York. And finally, Dr. Erwin Stelzer, who is Resident Scholar and Director of Regulatory Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. He has served on a number of national committees concerning energy policy. He's also American economic and political columnist for the London Sunday Times, and he's also in our Washington studio. Well, after that mouthful, welcome to the program.
Good morning.
Professor, Juanima Lubiano, what are your broad reflections after nearly a year of saturation campaigning? And now that we know the results, where are you looking forward to and what are you looking forward to?
Actually, what I'm most looking forward to is for the Democrats, for Bill Clinton, to deliver on the promises that he's made to consider the United States once again as a collective, as a diverse population collective. And I'm looking forward to seeing him address the economic inequality that a military-industrial economy has managed to perpetuate through most of the century. I recognize that it's a difficult proposition to undertake because to some extent the economic damage that's been done to the larger collectivity is great enough that simply righting the most pressing damages is a full-time commitment.
Erwin Stelzer, what is your mood? What is your expectation the morning after Election Day?
Well, I guess I'm one of those increasingly lonely voices you mentioned. I think the economy is basically strong and recovering. I think that the inequalities of income that people are talking about are much overdone. I think America remains the world's greatest superpower and country with the highest standard of living. I think Clinton has been elected to affect some changes and will probably benefit from a rapidly recovering economy, which would have recovered no matter who was elected.
But speaking as a conservative, you're not unduly concerned at a Democrat president?
I'm not unduly concerned about this Democratic president. There were several others who preceded him. I think the lessons he learned from the failed redistributionist campaigns of Dukakis and others will stand him in good stead. And I think his real problem is going to come from a hyperactive, much more vigorous Congress than he's going to find he can afford to be.
Noam Chomsky, you voted for Clinton, although I imagine that was more an anti-Bush vote than pro-Clinton. Even so, do you have any positive expectation from a new administration?
Yes, and in voting against Bush, I think I probably reflected a good bit of the general mood. It was a negative mandate. Positive change, I pretty much agree with Dr. Stelzer. I think that Clinton is a right-wing Democrat, a representative of the business community. I don't expect substantial changes. There'll be some slight effort towards public investment to try to overcome the disastrous impact of Reaganomics. But one of the effects of the Reagan-Bush era has been to increase the level of indebtedness in every part of the society, federal, state, local, corporate, household, to the point where constructive social programs would be difficult to undertake under the best of circumstances. As Clinton represents pretty much more of the same with slight changes, I would not expect any effort to address the drift of the country towards a kind of two-tiered third world model with sectors, large sectors in a rich country like this, but sectors of great wealth and privilege, but a growing and rising sea of despair and misery.
Stephen Hess, you've voted Democrat for the first time in 28 years. Why did you do that? And what hopes have you invested in Clinton?
Let me say that the last time I voted for a Democrat, I voted for Lyndon Johnson because I didn't want us to get involved in the Vietnam War. So I'm hoping for a little better success this time. What happened, I think, was that George Bush went from a landslide victory 4 years ago, winning 40 of 50 states, to a landslide defeat. The future, I think, political scientists will remember it as the great Bush lesson, which is no matter what happens in the world, as far as the American electorate is concerned, you had best be attentive to the domestic economy. I think that if unemployment had been 2 points lower and gross domestic product had been 2 points higher, he would have been reelected. But I do think, whether it had happened this year or 4 years from now, that we're at the end of a conservative leg of the usual cycles that we see in American politics. The conservative movement has simply run out of steam. The people who are in the administration are tired. I simply felt, as I know the American people felt, that it was a time for change. And so it was exactly, for other reasons, but exactly the same as Professor Chomsky. I voted and the American people voted not for Bill Clinton positively, but against George Bush.
Okay, can I just address some broad issues now as we work our way through this discussion? America, over time, has claimed the mantle as the model of freedom, as the proof that free market capitalism is the best system that there is, and as the economic powerhouse. But as an outside observer, I get a strong sense of social dislocation, of a growing gap between haves and have-nots, of growing social, economic and political alienation. Now, how accurate an impression is that? How deep are the social problems, and are they something that can be fixed simply with stronger economic growth? Erwin Stelzer.
I think your impression is wrong. You're probably reading the New York Times and listening to some network or other.
And the Washington Post.
And the Washington Post. Well, there's a random sample for you, the New York Times and the Washington Post. I think it's a completely wrong impression. It's probably as wrong as Americans' impression of Australia as consisting of kangaroos and koala bears. This is still a strong, rich country with pockets of social problems. It is the world's remaining superpower. It is democratic capitalism is the model to which the entire world is now looking for its own salvation, and the notion that alternative models produce higher levels of income and consumer welfare is just wrong, as you can ask anyone in any country which has a different model. The American dream, you don't find large numbers of Americans trying to get out of the country into other countries. You find large numbers of people from other countries trying to get into America. People vote with their feet, and I think that says something about the viability of democratic capitalism.
Well, the kind of urban problems that we all read about and that we see on television screens and we see depicted in a variety of ways, are they a myth?
No, they're not a myth. There are urban problems. But you know, if I get up in the morning and kiss my wife and go to work, that's not news. If I get up in the morning and murder her, that's news. So that I think you're getting a distorted vision of the lives of most Americans.
I had an impression that there were more of you getting up and doing the latter rather than the former.
That's because, again, you read the wrong newspapers. Try some from Central America, from Middle America. Buy a few Ohio newspapers, some Arizona newspapers, some Colorado newspapers, and you'll get an idea of what's important.
But you do acknowledge, I think from our conversations earlier, you do acknowledge social problems, and I think you largely see those problems as race-based problems, and you see those problems as largely insoluble. Is that correct?
I think that's right. I think America has a terrible racial problem, and partly a heritage of an unfortunate past. I think that those problems, which are concentrated in certain parts of certain cities, are, in my judgment, very, very difficult to solve, if not insoluble. They certainly don't lend themselves to any solutions we have so far tried. And I'm very, very skeptical as to whether or not the pouring of more money into the types of social programs we've had in the past is going to do anything at all to solve those problems. I think we can try to ameliorate them with a variety of reforms of the welfare system and the education system. But I think there are certain fundamental problems with which we will just have to learn how to live and try to temper as best we can.
But effectively that is accepting of a permanent underclass.
It is accepting a permanent underclass, a permanent, but I hope shrinking, but I think you will always have in this country, given the drug problem, which is more or less insoluble, given the enormous amounts of income that are channeled through that system and into creating a permanent underclass, I don't see any solution to that on the horizon. I think that's a sad thing to say, but I think that's a realistic thing to say, so that we don't throw huge amounts of money that can be employed in other social problems that we can solve on social problems that we can't.
Juanima Lubiano, how deep, as far as you are concerned, is the social alienation, and is that alienation largely race-based?
Actually, I was amazed listening to the former speaker at the Pollyanna version that was just trotted out of what I consider incredible social dislocation, an incredible history of inequality that stems not just across the urban terrain, but across the national terrain. For example, when the previous speaker was talking about reading newspapers from the Midwest, from the heartland, does he read the farm news? Does he have any idea of the devastation that this economy has wreaked on farmers across the heartland? If he read some of the farm news coming out of that heartland, I don't think he could be quite as full of savoir-faire as he does about what's going on in the United States, the economy, the political terrain, the social terrain is not natural nor inevitable. It is the result of particular programs and policies. It's a result of driving the economy in a particular direction. It is a result of having taxpayers underwrite corporate laissez-faire capitalism. This is not the result of an underclass. The underclass is a result of policies and structures in the economy. When I listened to the previous speaker talk about getting up in the morning and kissing one's wife, and the fact that the United States doesn't have a large group of people leaving the United States, I'd consider that he might think about 30 million Americans living in poverty who don't have the means to go anywhere else, and if they did, they would rapidly find that anywhere else is affected by the kind of economic and foreign clout that the United States exercises. The United States dislocation of unemployment, for example, is not just dragging down employment in the United States, it's affecting labor all over the world. The United States' decline in attention to occupational safety will not just affect the United States, it affects labor all over the world. The individuals, 26 million of whom are eking out their incomes by using food stamps, are not just in the urban areas, they're spread out across the entire terrain. We just watched more than a decade of an income transfer of 66% to 1% of the sector of the U.S. economy. To talk about the inevitability of an underclass, to talk about pockets of problems, is to be willfully blind to 100 years of evidence.
But so you disagree, obviously, as to the depth or extent of the problem. I think that's an understatement.
Yes.
But do you believe that those problems are so deep-rooted that they are effectively insoluble within your system of
They're
government?
not the Grand Canyon. Those problems are not the result of natural forces. They are the result of guided forces, which means that if those forces were guided to their present direction, they can be guided in another direction. But on the other hand, I agree completely with Professor Chomsky that I see little indication that Bill Clinton is about to make the move of the magnitude that would redirect the forces. We have the present inequity because of government, because of state, because of corporate direction, not because, like the Grand Canyon, those things happen and can't be changed.
Okay, Stephen Hess, what do you say?
Well, I think it's a question between the two former speakers of which end of the telescope you choose to look through. I think for 80% of the American people, a population of 250 million, things are pretty good to very good. Better than you would find in other diverse countries of this size. For another 25 or 30 million people, they are certainly not good. What will Bill Clinton do? I think Bill Clinton believes in an activist government. I think he's limited by what he sees as the size of the debt. I think he would like to do something, but above all, Bill Clinton is a professional politician. Just look at how he ran for president this year. He started out meaning to run as a conservative Democrat. When Paul Tsongas, an opponent, got to the right of him, he turned out to be a liberal Democrat. Then when he ultimately had to run against George Bush, he moved to the middle. To some degree, you can say this is exactly what Franklin D. Roosevelt was in 1932, an unknown quantity, another governor. We didn't know what kind of a president he would be. Of course, this isn't the Great Depression, but nevertheless, we have been in recession. It's been long, if not terribly deep. I don't know what kind of president Bill Clinton is going to be. I certainly don't know what kind of president he's going to be toward the rest of the world where he's had no experience. I am more optimistic than, for instance, Professor Chomsky, because I think he is very smart. I think he wants to have a place in history. And I think for a Democrat, the most likely way of getting a place of history is to move toward activism in government. So we shall see. It is a very big question mark, and I don't think anybody, even the people closest to him, will tell you what kind of a presidency we will have had 4 years from now.
Okay, Noam Chomsky, you said in a recent interview in Rolling Stone that you can see a definite improvement in America in the past 20 or 30 years, that there's been a cultural revolution in America that people in power are scared to death of. What sort of revolution, and how does that stack against this social alienation that I think you also perceive?
The alienation, incidentally, is not what I perceive. It's very clear in polls. There are annual studies of levels of alienation from institutions which keep rising and have now reached historic highs. In fact, over 80% of the population by now describes the economic system as inherently unfair, which is not surprising after 20 years of relative stagnation, and in fact, in the last 10 years, decline of real wages for some 80%, 75, 80% of the population. Incomes have in fact declined absolutely in the last 10 years, while a very small sector, 1 or maybe even 0.5%, have been enormously enriched. So the alienation is quite real. About 75% of the population in the most recent Gallup polls feel very little hope about the future, which is something historically unprecedented. Now, the United States is an extremely wealthy society with enormous advantages. That's been that way for 200 years, and it would take unparalleled advantages. It takes more than 10 years of Reaganomics to destroy this. So it remains the richest economy in the world, but it is one that is facing extremely serious problems. They're not race problems particularly, they're mostly class problems. If you look at hunger and mortality and homelessness and so on, and you break these phenomena up into both, if you separate the race and class factors, you find that they're primarily class. That's why, for example, that's why President Reagan is, in studies of working class Americans, ranks as the highest, the most unpopular among major political figures. Now, the United States is not a free market economy and never has been, neither is any other modern society. It's a society with a highly interventionist state. That's how we developed an economy, and that's the way we maintained one. Same has been true from England to South Korea. The same was true right through Reaganism. For example, Reagan approximately doubled the percentage of imports that are subject to protectionist measures, and carried out the largest nationalization in American history when a Continental National Bank failed. The Pentagon system alone has been a major form of state intervention to maintain the viability of the advanced sectors of economy. Where the United States differs from other industrial societies is that the state intervention tends more to be to the benefit of the wealthy and less toward the welfare, towards social welfare. And this reflects in part the weakness of popular organizations. So unions are extremely weak. There are no political organizations. There are very few ways for people to become engaged directly in management of their own affairs. It's a business-run society to an unusual extent, and the population suffers. Nevertheless, this cultural revolution that you mentioned and that I mentioned, I think is entirely real, and I think everyone's aware of it. Since the 1960s, there have been very perceptible and significant changes in the public mood. There's far greater concern among the general public. It has no institutional effects as yet, but among the general public, there's far greater concern for issues of racist and sexist oppression, there's far greater respect for other cultures. There's concerns over the environment, which are entirely new. The government is well aware of this. So, for example, the Reagan administration attempted, when it came in, to duplicate what John F. Kennedy did in Vietnam, that is, just to send the American Air Force to blast the place, as Kennedy did 30 years ago. But they couldn't. They started, there was an enormous unanticipated public protest. They had to move to unprecedented levels of clandestine warfare, clandestine terror, which is undertaken mainly to keep your own domestic population in the dark. Right as the ground campaign began in the Gulf, there was a leaked document from the Bush administration pointing out that it said that in the case of confrontation with much weaker enemies, meaning anyone in the third world, the United States must defeat them rapidly and decisively because anything else would undercut political support, understood to be very thin. If the Columbus quincentennial had been 30 years ago, it would have been another celebration of liberation of the hemisphere. this time. It had to be that it was very much muted. It was necessary. In the past 30 years, for the first time in our history, it's been possible, even in scholarship, to begin to face the reality of what happened to the indigenous population. Now, these are all very substantial. The solidarity movements with Central America, which were right in the Midwest, in conservative, mainstream America, in church circles and so on, were unprecedented. These are all changes in the mood. Sorry.
I know this is an ambitious program. They often are, and we'll end up only covering a tenth of what we want to. But for the rest of it, can I ask you all to try to address the questions as briefly as possible? I know it's frustrating, but I'd like to go to several specific issues. One, Christian fundamentalism and the growth of Christian fundamentalism in the United States. What is the perception as to how that will grow for the rest of this decade, and what impact? How significant is it? What impact will it have in terms of the political debate and the social debate as well? Irving Seltzer.
Well, I think Christian fundamentalism and the sort of right-wing programs that it tends to favor, the intrusions into personal life and so on, I personally find a bit scary. I think there will be, starting this morning, a war for control of the Republican Party in which the Pats, Robertson and Buchanan, will be warring with the likes of Jack Kemp. I think the Christian fundamentalists will remain a strong influence in Republican primaries, just as the left is a strong influence in Democratic primaries. But basically, if this election taught the Republicans anything, it has to have taught them to marginalize that group or be doomed to being lumbered with social issues which simply do not have the support of anything approximating a substantial minority.
And do you think that they will be? And do you think that mainstream Republicans, traditional Republicans, will be able to retain control of the party?
Well, it depends what you mean by mainstream Republicans, but let's say that the Christian right, I don't think, will gain control of the Republican Party. I think there will be a question of whether you're going to have a Quayle or a Kemp or something like that. I think there will be some influence by the Christian right, and it was, but I think the lesson that people have taken away, the Republicans have taken away from this election, is that they better marginalize that group or not plan on being an effective force in American politics for a very long time.
Juanima Lubiano, the question of Christian fundamentalism?
Right. Actually, I'm not as concerned about Christian fundamentalism taking over the Republican Party as I am concerned about the cultural terrain, the ground on which the Christian right is fighting. And the reason I'm concerned about that has to do with the efficacy of the Christian right at organizing at the local level. And organizing not necessarily on, their success in organizing is not necessarily on the grounds of religious fervor, but it has to do with countering the very cultural revolution that Professor Chomsky was describing. That cultural revolution has not necessarily been turned to political ends, both because of a lack of popular focus for the organizing, but also because, to a great extent, the fears that that cultural revolution has produced at the level of the state and at the level of corporate overlords is allowing the energy of that revolution to be dissipated by the Christian right's challenge to that very cultural revolution.
But the question
at the local level.
The question is, the question is are we going to see continued growth and substantial growth of Christian fundamentalism and its support in the United States over this decade?
It doesn't, okay, I'm trying to answer the question by saying that whether the support goes under the name of the Christian right or not, it makes its way into all the arenas where people talk, where people organize themselves, where people think through their reactions to the world around them. So whether as an organized plank it makes itself known, or whether because it infiltrates in so many different areas and draws on a diverse population, the Christian right, for example, effectively crosses class lines and race lines, much more so than any other single entity in the United States. It's its dispersion that I find more frightening than its centrality in the Republican Party.
Okay, next issue, Stephen Hess. I'm intrigued to know whether you'll see substantial changes in the makeup of the judiciary at the federal level. Reagan and Bush over time were both accused of stacking the courts, and I suppose it's an old tradition of stacking the courts with those of their ilk. Now, would you expect that Clinton would reverse that game, would reverse that trend? And what scope does he have to do that, and what impact would that have?
Oh, absolutely. No question about it. It's a game that the Republicans have played. It's now a game that the Democrats have played. The judiciary has become the best, richest, most attractive patronage that the federal government has to give out. We've expanded it. There are a lot of open seats on the court, particularly because in the last Congress, the Democratic Congress, they kept them open, waiting for a Democratic president. No doubt that if Clinton stays in for 8 years, that he can reverse it quite considerably. There are a number of justices of the Supreme Court who are getting on in years, some who I suspect have held on, waiting for another Democratic president. We will see a fair number of judges of the lower court leaving the bench because one of the things that the Reagan-Bush people did was appoint quite young jurists, and I think they're going to find that as their children get into college, they have to make more money. And so we're going to have a fair exodus from the courts, and of course, with a Democratic president and a Democratic senator, so we haven't got the usual gridlock. That's going to be one of the outcomes of this administration, and for all I know, when we talk again in 4 years, the most important outcome of the Clinton presidency.
All right, well then, just on that point, when you say the most important outcome, let me throw this to the four of you and grab it who will. What is the importance of that in the overall scheme of things? What is the importance of control of the judiciary?
Well, let me start. It's quite important in, I think, two senses. One is the judiciary will, in the end, determine the outer limits to which government can intrude in personal affairs and the outer limits of governmental power in business affairs. So I think it's going to be quite important in the long run. I quite agree that we'll now see a very, very definite change in the character of appointments and the leanings of judges. And in fact, the activists in both parties always viewed this as the most important and durable consequence of this election. I don't think there's any question about that.
Noam Chomsky, how important in your view?
It's important. I think it's, in my view, we should bear in mind that the two political parties are both essentially right-wing business parties, and that's not going to change. Their attitudes on major issues of social policy and public policy and so on, are often quite different from those of the general population. However, the role of the judiciary is quite significant in, for example, in issues of civil liberties, intrusions in personal privacy, and so on and so forth. The Republican popular base and much of its leadership element they call themselves conservatives, but an old-fashioned conservative would turn over in his grave to hear that term defamed by association with this group, which are really statist reactionaries. They believe in a highly interventionist state, which also intervenes radically in private life. And the judiciary the change in the judiciary in the past 10 years has had an extremely negative impact on civil liberties. I mean, you can see that from the fact that we actually had a presidential candidate, George Bush, who was able to accuse his opponent in 1988 of being a card-carrying member of the American Civil Liberties Union, a conservative organization concerned with upholding the Constitution, described as if it was a communist organization. Now, I don't think that, I think that under a Clinton administration, there will be at least this intrusion of reactionary statists, anti-civil libertarian elements into the federal judiciary will stop, and though I don't expect a very substantial change in other directions, because Clinton is a representative of a different sector of corporate America, a somewhat more forthcoming, less reactionary sector, but with essentially the same interests.
Juanima Lubiano, I have a suspicion that you might have a similar line as Noam Chomsky, but if you have anything to add briefly, because we're just about out of time, please do.
Actually, I would add this briefly. I do agree with Professor Chomsky, but I would add that given the assault on civil liberties, it's the level of the courts immediately below the Supreme Court that's most important. Supreme Court hears maybe 150 cases in the year. The court level below hears more than 40,000. So most of the assaults on civil liberties will be resolved at that level. And therefore, it seems to me that is an important site for judicial intervention. But apart from that, I do agree with Professor Chomsky.
Okay, and that, unfortunately, is where we're going to have to leave it tonight. But Erwin Stelzer, Stephen Hess, Noam Chomsky, and Juanima Lubiano, thank you all very much for joining us tonight. Thank you. And now let's find out what's making headlines in tomorrow's newspapers back here in Australia. The Australian says Bill Clinton's landslide election win gives him a mandate to revitalise America's economy in the post-Cold War era. Clinton's New Beginning pledge is also bannered by the Herald Sun, which, like most papers, carries other special reports on the election on its inside pages. The Financial Review highlights the prospect of a trade war between the US and the European community following the collapse of last-ditch talks in Chicago. And a follow-up on a story that started several months ago when racial tensions erupted at Casino High School in the north of New South Wales. An inquiry was commissioned by Virginia Chadwick, the New South Wales Minister for Education. A copy of the report's findings has fallen into the hands of Paola Totaro, the education reporter for the Sydney Morning Herald, who joins me now from Sydney. Paola, I recall the original reporting of this incident and the claims and counterclaims. What is the essence of the report's findings?
Well, the report has found, Kerry, that not only were there two incidents that we reported earlier this year had actually occurred, but that there have been persistent incidents of racism over a period of 6 to 10 years in that school, and that the complaints that the Aboriginal community has made over the years to the school and to the department were justified and were correct.
And what are the substantial recommendations?
Well, there are some major recommendations. The first is that the school, well, first of all, all teachers in the school, including the principal and the deputy and ancillary staff, have been offered voluntary redundancies. They've got 2 weeks to decide whether they'll move on or not. But the school will be given a special category, which means that in future any executive appointments will be made by a panel of Aboriginal community members, of teachers, of union officials. The other important recommendation is that all current teachers and future teachers will undergo sensitisation programs into the needs of the Aboriginal community and Aboriginal students. They're really the major ones, but there are some 60 recommendations, and they go across the board, including the management of the school.
It sounds an extraordinary recommendation that they would offer redundancies to all 90 of the teachers, or transfers.
They've not offered redundancies, Kerry. They've offered voluntary transfers.
Voluntary transfers.
Yeah,
I'm sorry,
so it means that
redundancies.
Yeah, no transfers. It means that the teachers can choose to move on.
Okay, but that doesn't suggest that because there'd be a cloud over the school. That doesn't suggest that those 90 teachers are all in some way guilty of.
No. There were some teachers that were involved in these incidents. A couple of teachers, I think. I know of one certainly that's been transferred and has moved on, but certainly no, not all the teachers at that school should be tarred with.
But to the extent that charges of racism have been established, as far as this report is concerned, what are some of the illustrations of incidents that would be considered undesirable or repugnant?
Well, there's the one that broke the camel's back, I guess, which occurred on May 26, when an Aboriginal male student was suspended for calling his teacher an asshole. Now, it turns out that student had reacted immediately to the teacher calling his students, Aboriginal students, scum and vermin. Now, that was proved and that actually occurred. The teacher was made to apologise and that's been laid to rest. There are a number of other incidents in this report. There was one case when a number of students were removed from the school by the police in police wagons, contrary to the police authority and school memorandum, which gives guidelines of how these incidents are to be handled. There was another case where there was a skirmish between black and white students. No white students were suspended. Black students were suspended, but when the review panel required formal details of these suspensions, well, the formal details had been lost. There was another case when a senior teacher renamed National Aboriginals Day the day before and called it Australiana Day. Now, that was regarded as an insult by the Aboriginal community, and indeed the report said that it was certainly an act of indirect racism.
Paola, obviously there's a lot more to the story, but we're going to have to read about it in tomorrow's papers. Thanks very much for talking with us.
Thank you.
And tomorrow on Late Line, a view of Somalia through the eyes of an internationally famous expatriate going home. That's all from us tonight. Good night.
You all spoke with equal voices for change, and tomorrow we will try to give you that.